The engine coughed once, then died. Captain William Hayes stood at the wheel of the SS Cordelia, his merchant vessel now transformed into an ark of desperate men, and listened to the silence that followed. 200 soldiers packed his deck, some sitting, some standing, all bleeding or burned or broken in ways that wouldn't show for years. The ship was already listing 3 degrees to starboard from the weight. 1 more degree, and the channel would claim them all. But Hayes wasn't looking at his instruments. He was looking back at the beach. Through the black smoke rolling across Dunkirk's shoreline, through the orange bursts of artillery fire that turned the morning sky into a painter's nightmare, he could see a figure, small, alone, standing at the water's edge while everyone else scrambled toward the larger destroyers further down the coast. The boy, and Hayes was certain now it was a boy, wasn't waving. He was just standing there, holding something against his chest, a kit bag maybe, or a rifle he didn't know how to use. "Captain!" First Mate Davies appeared at his elbow, his face gray with exhaustion and something deeper. "We're overloaded by half. If we take on any more weight—" "I can see the waterline, Mr. Davies." "Then you can see we won't make it across if we go back." Hayes didn't answer. He was doing the mathematics in his head, the cold arithmetic of survival that every merchant captain learned in peacetime and perfected in war. 200 lives versus 1. A damaged engine versus 12 miles of open water. A listing ship versus the Luftwaffe that would return when the clouds cleared. The equation solved itself. But then the boy moved, just slightly. He took 1 step into the surf, then stopped. As if he'd hit an invisible wall, the water reached his knees, but he went no further. "Start the engine," Hayes said quietly. "Captain!" "Start the bloody engine, Mr. Davies." The first mate opened his mouth, closed it, then disappeared below deck. A moment later, the engine coughed again. This time it caught, and the Cordelia shuddered beneath Hayes's feet like an old dog waking from a dream of younger days. On the deck, the soldiers stirred. Some of them understood what the sound meant. They'd just escaped hell, and now hell's door was opening again. Hayes turned the wheel. The SS Cordelia had been built in 1923 to carry coal and timber between Liverpool and Oslo. She was never meant to be fast, never meant to be beautiful, and certainly never meant to be a warship. But when the Royal Navy sent out the call for every available vessel to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk, Hayes hadn't hesitated. He'd been hauling lumber when the telegram arrived. He'd dumped the cargo in Portsmouth Harbour, thousands of pounds worth of Norwegian pine, just tipped it into the water like garbage, and set course for France with a crew of 7 and a hold full of nothing but hope. That had been 3 days. Go. Since then, Hayes had made 4 trips across the channel. 4 times he'd navigated through the wreckage of ships that hadn't been as lucky or as careful. 4 times he'd pulled men off that beach, men who looked at his unremarkable merchant vessel like it was the Queen Mary herself. He'd saved maybe 600 soldiers total. He'd lost 2 crew members, one to a Stuka's machine gun, one to exhaustion when his heart simply gave out on the 3rd crossing. This was supposed to be the last trip, the final run. Hayes had promised his remaining crew that after this, they'd go home. The Cordelia had earned her rest. But now the engine was running again, and the ship was turning, and every man on deck knew what that meant. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. Hayes didn't know if it was a prayer or a curse. Maybe both. The boy was still there when the Cordelia's bow cut back through the surf. Hayes could see him more clearly now through the smoke. 15, maybe 16 years old. British uniform, but no helmet. No rifle either. What he'd been holding was a haversack, clutched against his chest like a child's teddy bear. The beach around him was chaos choreographed by desperation. Thousands of men formed snaking lines into the water, waiting for the destroyers and minesweepers and fishing boats that appeared and disappeared through the smoke like ghosts. The sand was littered with abandoned equipment, rifles, helmets, gas masks, all the weight that men shed when survival becomes the only objective. German artillery had found the range hours ago. Every few minutes, a shell would arc over the dunes and explode in the surf, sending up geysers of water and sand, and sometimes pieces of men who'd been standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The boy didn't flinch when the shells hit. He just stood there, knee-deep in the channel, staring at the Cordelia as she approached. "Prepare to take on one passenger," Hayes called down to the deck. Davies appeared again, his expression somewhere between disbelief and resignation. "One passenger, Captain? You heard me. There are thousands on that beach, and we're taking one." Hayes didn't explain further. He couldn't, really. How do you explain instinct? How do you justify a decision that defies every rational calculation, every survival equation, every reasonable argument? You don't. You just do it. The Cordelia slowed as she entered the shallow water. Hayes could feel the keels scraping sand, could feel the ship's protest in the vibration that ran through the wheel into his hands. Much closer, and they'd beach themselves, become another piece of wreckage for the next tide to bury. "Drop a line," he shouted. Two soldiers on deck, men Hayes had pulled from the water on his last run, threw a rope toward the boy. It fell short. They hauled it back, coiled it, threw again. This time the boy caught it. For a moment he just held the rope, staring at it like he'd forgotten what it was for. Then, slowly, he tied it around his waist with the careful precision of someone who'd been taught sailor's knots by a father who cared about such things. "Pull him in," Hayes commanded. The soldiers hauled. The boy came with the rope, stumbling through the surf, still clutching that haversack. When he reached the hull, hands reached down. A dozen hands. 20 hands, soldiers helping soldiers in the way that only men who've shared hell can help each other. They pulled him aboard. Hayes didn't wait. The moment the boy's feet cleared the gunwale, he reversed the engine and began backing the Cordelia away from the beach. The keel scraped again, a sound like the world's largest fingernail on the world's largest chalkboard, and then they were free, turning, pointing back toward England, toward home, toward safety. But the Luftwaffe had other plans. They came out of the sun. 3 Messerschmitt fighters in tight formation, their engines screaming like tortured metal. Hayes saw them first, just dark crosses against the bright morning sky, and in the second before he shouted the warning, he thought about all the decisions that had led to this moment. The decision to answer the call, the decision to make one more trip, the decision to turn back for a boy who probably wasn't going to survive anyway. "Aircraft!" Someone screamed, and the deck erupted into chaos. The soldiers who still had rifles raised them, pointing at the sky with the futile defiance of men who knew small arms fire wouldn't stop a fighter plane but refused to die passive. Others simply dove for whatever cover they could find, behind the gunnels, behind the cabin, behind each other. Hayes gripped the wheel and did the only thing he could do. He held the course. The first fighter opened fire at 400 yards. Hayes could see the muzzle flashes along the wing, could see the tracers arcing down like falling stars, and then the bullets hit. They stitched a line across the bow, punching through the deck with sounds like hammers on tin. Wood splintered, metal shrieked. Someone screamed, a short, sharp sound that ended too quickly. The fighter roared overhead, so close Hayes could see the pilot's face, young and focused and completely without mercy. Then it was gone, climbing for another pass. "Return fire!" Davies was shouting, though they had no real weapons, nothing but those rifles that couldn't reach high enough or hit hard enough. But the soldiers fired anyway, because doing something, anything, was better than waiting to die. The second fighter came in lower, strafing the deck from stern to bow. Hayes threw himself against the wheel, felt bullets snap past his head close enough to hear them whisper. The windows of the wheelhouse exploded inward in a shower of glass that glittered like diamonds in the smoke-filtered sunlight. More screaming, more blood on the deck. The Cordelia was taking damage now, real damage. Hayes could feel it in the way she handled, the way she responded to the wheel like a horse that's been spurred too hard. A fuel line must have been hit because he could smell diesel mixing with the salt air and the cordite and the copper scent of blood. The third fighter was lining up its run when the clouds saved them. A massive bank of gray cumulus rolled in from the north, pushed by winds that had probably started somewhere over Scotland. It swallowed the sky in seconds, turning the morning from bright to dim like someone had thrown a blanket over the sun. The fighters circled once, looking for an opening, then gave up and disappeared into the cloud cover. They had easier targets, slower ships, beaches full of soldiers who couldn't shoot back. The Cordelia limped on. Hayes did a damage assessment while Davies took the wheel. 3 dead, 7 wounded. The bow had taken the worst of it, dozens of bullet holes that would need patching before they reached Portsmouth, assuming they reached Portsmouth. The fuel situation was manageable if they didn't push the engine too hard. But they were afloat. They were moving. They were alive. Hayes found the boy sitting against the aft cabin wall, still clutching that haversack. There was blood on the deck near him. Not his blood, but the blood of a soldier who'd been standing 2 feet away when the second fighter's bullets found him. The boy's face was speckled with it, small drops like reverse freckles. He looked up when Hayes approached. His eyes were blue and young and completely empty. "You all right, son?" Hayes asked. The boy nodded. He didn't speak. Hayes crouched down, his knees popping like small firecrackers. Up close, he could see the boy more clearly. Definitely 15, maybe younger. His uniform was too big for him, the kind of fit that suggested either a rushed enlistment or a quartermaster who didn't care enough to find the right size. His boots were caked with sand that was already drying in the wind. "What's your name?" For a long moment, Hayes thought the boy wasn't going to answer. Then quietly, "Private Thomas Whitmore, 5th Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment." "Where's the rest of your unit, Thomas?" "Dead." The word was flat, emotionless, delivered with the tone of someone reporting the weather, cloudy with a chance of death. "All of them?" "Most of them. We were holding the perimeter near Berges. The panzers came through on the 3rd day. We fell back to the beach, but—" He trailed off, staring at something only he could see. "The sergeant told me to wait at the waterline. Said they'd come back for me after they found transport for the wounded. That was 2 days ago." Hayes felt something tighten in his chest. 2 days. This boy had been standing on that beach for 2 days, watching ships come and go, watching men evacuate, just waiting for orders that were never going to come because the man who gave them was probably dead. "What's in the bag?" Hayes asked, nodding at the haversack. Thomas looked down at it like he'd forgotten he was holding it. His grip loosened slightly. "Letters," he said. "From the lads who didn't make it. They asked me to send them home, to their families, so they'd know what happened." He opened the bag. Inside were dozens of envelopes, some sealed, some just folded paper. Some were stained with blood or mud or seawater. Each one was addressed in the careful handwriting of men who knew they were writing their last words. Hayes reached out and gently closed the bag. "You'll get them home," he said. "I promise you that." Thomas nodded, but his expression didn't change. Whatever capacity he'd had for hope or relief or gratitude had been burned out of him on that beach, cauterized by 2 days of watching death arrive in waves. Hayes stood up, his knees popping again. He was 53 years old. Too old for this war, too old for heroics, too old to be making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But he'd made the promise anyway. They were 6 miles from the French coast when the engine died again. This time there was no cough, no warning. The Cordelia's heartbeat just stopped, and the sudden silence was louder than any explosion. Davies appeared from below deck, his hands black with oil, his expression grim. "Fuel lines severed," he reported. "That last strafe cut it clean through. We've been running on fumes for the past 20 minutes. Hayes looked back toward Dunkirk. The smoke was still visible, a dark smudge on the horizon, but they'd made it far enough that the sound of artillery was just a distant rumble now, like summer thunder. Then he looked forward, toward England. The coast wasn't visible yet, wouldn't be for another hour at least, but it was there. Home was there. 6 miles between them and France. 6 miles between them and England, and the Cordelia was dead in the water. "Can we repair it?" Hayes asked, though he already knew the answer. Davies shook his head. "Not without dry dock. The line's in the engine compartment, behind the main assembly. We'd need to dismantle half the engine to reach it, and even if we could, we don't have replacement parts. So we're drifting." "We're drifting." Hayes did the mathematics again. The channel's current would carry them northeast at maybe 2 knots. They had maybe 12 hours before nightfall. The Royal Navy was conducting patrols, sweeping for stragglers, but finding one small merchant vessel in 12 miles of open water was like finding a specific coin in a fountain. On deck, the soldiers were starting to understand. The veterans knew what a dead engine meant. They'd seen enough disabled ships in the past week to understand the odds. Some of them sat down, conserving energy. Others stood at the rail, staring toward England like they could will the coast closer. A few started praying, quiet words carried away by the wind. Thomas Whitmore was still sitting against the cabin wall, still holding his haversack full of dead men's letters. Hayes walked to the bow and looked at the damage. The bullet holes were mostly small, 9mm rounds from the Messerschmitt's machine guns, but there were enough of them to make the deck look like a cheese grater. Water was seeping through the lower holes, not much, but enough to be concerning over time. He was about to head back to the wheelhouse when he saw something that made him stop. In the distance, cutting through the gray water like a knife through silk, was a ship. For a moment, Hayes thought it was a destroyer, one of the Royal Navy vessels conducting the evacuation, but as it got closer, he realized it was smaller. A minesweeper maybe, or a patrol boat. He grabbed the signal flags from the wheelhouse and began waving them in the international distress pattern. On deck, soldiers started shouting, waving their arms, doing anything to attract attention. The ship altered course. It was coming toward them. Davies appeared at Hayes's elbow again, squinting at the approaching vessel. Is that a fishing trawler?" he asked. Hayes raised his binoculars. Davies was right. It was a fishing trawler, maybe 60 feet long, rust-stained and ancient, with nets still hanging from the rigging. But it was flying a British flag, and it was moving with purpose. "God bless the fishermen," Hayes muttered. The trawler came alongside 10 minutes later. Its captain was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same weathered wood as his ship, maybe 70 years old, with a white beard and eyes that had seen every variety of storm the channel could offer. "Need a tow?" he called across the water, his voice carrying the accent of somewhere in Cornwall. "Engine's dead," Hayes called back. "Can you get us to Portsmouth?" The old captain shook his head. "Can't tow you that far, not with my engine. But I can get you to Dover. Royal Navy's got tugs there that can take you the rest of the way." Dover. It wasn't Portsmouth, but it was England. It was home. "We'll take it," Hayes said. The fishermen threw across lines. Soldiers on the Cordelia caught them, tied them off with the expertise of men who'd learned rope work in basic training or Boy Scouts or from fathers who thought such skills mattered. The trawler's engine coughed. It sounded almost identical to the Cordelia's death rattle. Then caught, slowly, carefully, it began to pull. The Cordelia moved, not fast, not smoothly, but she moved. They were going home. It took 4 hours to reach Dover. 4 hours of slow progress across water that seemed to grow calmer with every mile, as if the channel itself was tired of war and violence and just wanted to rest. The sun came out in the 3rd hour, breaking through the clouds that had saved them from the Luftwaffe. It turned the water from grey to blue, turned the coast of England from a dark line to a white-cliffed promise. Hayes stood at the wheel even though there was nothing to steer, watching that coastline grow closer. Around him, the soldiers began to relax. Some of them slept, real sleep, not the half-conscious vigilance they'd maintained for days. Others talked quietly, sharing cigarettes and stories and the beginnings of hope. Thomas Whitmore was still sitting against the cabin wall, but he'd opened his haversack and was reading the letters. Hayes watched him for a while, saw the boy's lips move as he read words written by men who were now just memories and bodies buried in French sand. When they were an hour from Dover, Hayes walked over and sat down next to him. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the letters. Thomas hesitated, then handed him one. The envelope was addressed to Mrs. Margaret Fletcher, 14 Bramley Road, Leeds. The letter inside was short, written in pencil on paper torn from a notebook. "Dear Mum, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it home. I'm sorry for that. I wanted to make you proud. I hope I did, at least a little. Tell Sarah I loved her. Tell Dad I'm sorry I never learned to fix that fence like he asked. It's not so bad here, really. The lads are good. We look after each other. Take care of yourself. Your son, James." Hayes folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. His hands were shaking slightly. "They all like that?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "Most of them. Some are longer. Some are just goodbye." And you're going to deliver them all? Yes, sir. That's a good thing you're doing, son. A hard thing, but a good thing. Thomas didn't respond. He took the letter back and placed it carefully in the haversack with the others. They sat in silence for a while, watching the coast grow closer. Then Thomas spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did you come back for me? Hayes considered the question. He thought about all the reasons he'd told himself, that every life matters, that leaving no man behind isn't just a motto, that someone had to be the last one saved. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. Because I could, he said finally. Because I had a ship and you needed one. Because sometimes that's all the reason you need. Thomas turned to look at him. For the first time since Hayes had pulled him aboard, there was something in the boy's eyes besides emptiness. Not quite hope, not quite relief, but something, recognition maybe. The understanding that in a world gone mad with war and violence and death, there were still people who would turn around for one boy on a beach. Thank you, Thomas said quietly. Hayes nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. They reached Dover as the sun was setting, turning the white cliffs gold and orange and red. The harbor was chaos. Ships everywhere, soldiers everywhere, volunteers and naval personnel and civilians who'd driven down from London just to help. A Royal Navy tug met them at the harbor entrance and took over the tow. The old Cornish fisherman who'd saved them waved once, then turned his trawler back toward the channel. There were more men to save, more ships to tow, more work to do. The Cordelia was guided to a pier where medical personnel were waiting. They took the wounded first, carrying them off on stretchers with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times in the past week. Then the able-bodied soldiers disembarked, filing down the gangway in an uneven line. Some of them stopped to shake Hayes's hand. Some just nodded. Some were too exhausted to do anything but stumble toward the waiting trucks that would take them to processing centers and hot meals and phones where they could call home. Thomas Whitmore was the last to leave. He stood at the top of the gangway with his haversack of letters, looking small and young and utterly lost. You know where to go? Hayes asked. No, sir. There'll be someone down there who can help. Tell them you're carrying letters from men who fell at Dunkirk. Tell them the letters need to be delivered. They'll make sure it happens. Thomas nodded. He took one step down the gangway, then stopped and turned back. Sir, what's your name? Captain William Hayes. I'll remember that, sir. When I'm old and telling my grandchildren about this war, I'll tell them about Captain William Hayes who turned his ship around. Hayes felt his throat tighten. You do that, son. And you make sure those grandchildren know it wasn't about being brave. It was just about doing what needed to be done. Thomas smiled, the first smile Hayes had seen from him. It was small and sad and genuine. Then he walked down the gangway and disappeared into the crowd. Hayes stood on the deck of the Cordelia for a long time after everyone had left, watching the sun finish its descent behind the cliffs. Davies and the remaining crew were below, assessing the damage, making lists of what needed to be repaired. The ship had taken a beating. Bullet holes in the deck and hull, severed fuel lines, damaged engine mounts, cracked windows. It would take weeks to fix, maybe months. But she'd made it. Against all odds, through all the chaos, she'd made it home. Hayes walked to the bow and ran his hand along the rail, feeling the splinters and the bullet scars and the salt-stained wood. The Cordelia was just a ship, steel and wood and rivets, built to carry cargo from one port to another. But for 1 week in May 1940, she'd been something more. She'd been hope. She'd been salvation. She'd been the difference between life and death for 700 men who would go home to families who would never know how close they'd come to losing someone they loved. And for one boy with a bag full of letters, she'd been the ship that turned around. Davies appeared beside him, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. Survey's done, Captain. She's hurt bad, but she'll sail again. Good, Hayes said. That's good. You know, sir, the lads are saying we're heroes. That what we did these past few days, it'll be in the history books. Hayes shook his head. We're not heroes, Mr. Davies. We're just sailors who did our jobs. The heroes are the men who held the perimeter so the evacuation could happen. The men who stayed behind so others could escape. The men who wrote those letters Thomas was carrying. Maybe, sir, but we saved a lot of lives. "We did," Hayes agreed. "And maybe that's enough." They stood together in the gathering dark, watching the harbor lights begin to flicker on. Somewhere in Dover, Thomas Whitmore was starting the long process of delivering letters to families who would weep when they read them. Somewhere in France, men were still fighting and dying and hoping for rescue. But here, on the deck of the SS Cordelia, there was peace. Hayes took one last look at his ship, then turned toward the gangway. "Come on, Mr. Davies, let's go home." They walked down together, their footsteps echoing on the wooden planks, leaving the Cordelia alone in the dark. But not forgotten. Never forgotten. Epilogue. The SS Cordelia was repaired and returned to merchant service in August 1940. She would make 4 more trips to Dunkirk before the evacuation officially ended, saving an additional 423 soldiers. In 1941, she was requisitioned by the Royal Navy and converted to a supply ship, running convoys to Malta in North Africa. She survived 3 U-boat attacks and 2 bombing runs. In 1943, she participated in the D-Day invasion, carrying supplies to Normandy beaches. She was decommissioned in 1946 and sold for scrap in 1948. Captain William Hayes continued to serve in the Merchant Navy throughout the war. He never spoke publicly about the Dunkirk evacuation, deflecting praise by saying he was just doing my job. He died in 1967 at the age of 78. Private Thomas Whitmore survived the war. He delivered every letter in his haversack, all 73 of them. It took him 6 months, traveling across England to personally hand each envelope to the families of the men who'd written them. In 1995, on the 55th anniversary of the Dunkirk evacuation, he gave an interview to the BBC. When asked what he remembered most about those terrible days, he said, "I remember standing in the water, thinking I'd been forgotten, thinking I was going to die on that beach. And then I saw a ship turn around. Just a small merchant vessel, nothing special. But to me, in that moment, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." The captain's name was William Hayes. I've never forgotten that. I'll never forget that there are people in this world who will turn their ships around for one frightened boy. Thomas Whitmore died in 2003 at the age of 78. The letters he delivered are now housed in the Imperial War Museum in London, a testament to the men who wrote them and the boy who made sure they reached home. And somewhere, in the records of the Dunkirk evacuation, there's a note about the SS Cordelia, a small merchant vessel that made 5 trips across the Channel and saved more than 1,000 lives. It doesn't mention that she turned around for one soldier who'd been forgotten. But William Hayes would have said that was the trip that mattered most. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more historical narratives that explore the human side of warfare. These aren't just stories about battles and strategies. They're about the impossible choices real people faced in humanity's darkest hours.